Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, May 7th around here, and we got a great show for you today. We will start talking about Sherrone Moore's suspension, something that I did not expect to pop up this week, but definitely want to get that off the plate first. We'll get into a couple other big-time storylines, but that was the biggest from this past week, so definitely want to jump into that first. Then we'll get into a little bit of a spring recap. There's a number of things that happened throughout spring practice that with a little bit of a hiatus, haven't been able to get into as much as I would want to. Want to do a brief overview, and then we'll start to get a little bit more nitty-gritty per team as we go forward through the next couple of weeks, and then we'll finish it off. I'll do my post-spring top 10. We'll be coming out with the top 25 here pretty soon, but top 10 is where I feel comfortable ranking these teams right about now, and we'll get into that at the very end of the show. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's start with the biggest story of the week, which is Sherrone Moore will be suspended for 2 games this upcoming year in the 2025 season, at least 2 games. These are self-imposed sanctions coming from that Connor Stalions scouting scandal that has been quite a bit old now at this point, but Michigan is still kind of paying the penance for some of the crimes that they committed. But Sherrone Moore is the one that is getting the boot right about now. He is going to be suspended for 2 games this upcoming season, and it sounds like it is going to be weeks 3 and weeks 4 against Central Michigan and then at Nebraska. Now, that Nebraska game is very, very interesting. The other thing to note here is he will not be able to coach in the week leading up to the games. I know when Jim Harbaugh was suspended in the past for these same type of things, he was allowed to coach up until the game and then wasn't allowed to be there on Saturday. That will not be the case in this scenario. He will not be allowed around the team throughout the week. So this will be a little bit more intensive, a little bit more of an intense ban than they gave to Jim Harbaugh a couple of years ago, but definitely something that it felt like Michigan had to do something, right? But suspending him for the 3rd and 4th games of the season made some people raise some eyebrows, and there is a relatively good reason why they didn't do the first 2 games. The first 2 games are New Mexico and then Oklahoma. And if you know anything about Sherrone Moore, he did go to Oklahoma back in the day. He played offensive line there for a number of years, was an incredible player for the Sooners, and he wants to coach against his former team. So I have to assume that's why they ended up doing the 3rd and 4th week. If they could do it, they probably would have done the 1st and 3rd week, but at the end of the day, that probably would have raised a couple more eyebrows around the NCAA. And I think it's really interesting, breaking down this kind of ongoing saga that has been going around Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we all kind of knew that Sherrone Moore, being kind of the last one there from that old crew, was going to be the one that probably got the brunt of the pain when it came to the actual infractions and came to the punishment that was going to come from Michigan. A lot of it was going to be put on Sherrone Moore's shoulders. He understood that when he took the job. I'm 100% sure of that. Now, is this enough? Becomes the big time question. Is this enough to keep the NCAA off his back? He wants to coach against his former team where he had so much success. Is he going to be able to do that, or will the NCAA see through kind of a sidestepping of some of the responsibility here and trying to just see if this is preemptive, see if they can get the NCAA off their case just a little bit by doing a little bit of a self-imposed suspension on their head coach. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. The other interesting thing here that doesn't necessarily have to do exactly with Michigan football, but is very important in this entire landscape, is Santa Ono, the former Michigan president, had been there for a very long time, was there when all of this was going on, was there with Jim Harbaugh, did a lot of different stuff, and has been a very well-known name around college sports recently. He is moving on. He's going to be the president of the University of Florida going forward, so that asks even more questions. He would be the person that would be as much in tune with what the NCAA is going to do as just about anyone around there. Is he a little bit nervous about what's coming down on Michigan here pretty soon? And is he someone that kind of pushed for this to be maybe a little bit more aggressive, and the Michigan football team wasn't quite willing to do that? So there's a lot of different moving parts here. This is a small piece of this. This is something that at the very least kind of caught my eye when I was going through Twitter, and this kind of came up on my page right as all of this stuff was going on. You're thinking, maybe this is a little bit deeper than we're thinking right about now. Maybe the NCAA is really gearing up for something a little bit bigger, and Michigan's just trying to get ahead of it. But more than anything, it comes down to that guy right there. What is Charlie Baker going to do? How is he going to handle this situation? Is he going to bring the hammer down on Michigan, or was this enough? Was this enough to kind of get him off the scent, allow them to breathe just for a little bit longer, and allow Michigan to say, we suspended them for 2 games, one of which being a road conference game? That's got to be enough, right? And everyone moves forward, and maybe that's the case. Maybe the NCAA is more than fine with what Michigan just did, and they say, okay, that's more than enough of a punishment, and they move on forward with their business. Obviously, they don't quite have the teeth to put in a lot of the penalties that they might want to in some of these cases, so it could just be kind of cutting your losses and saying, we'll take wins where we can get them, but I do think there's the other coin of that. There's the other side of the coin where you look up at the NCAA and they say, we see what you're doing. We see that you're trying to sidestep whatever aggression or whatever punishment is coming down from us. That doesn't make us all that happy. A lot of people are kind of toying around with the NCAA in different ways, saying they don't have a lot of power. We might as well do their job for them. We might as well, push them into a corner and say, we've already done a suspension. We've already done a punishment for our head coach. Why would you come in here and add to that punishment? The NCAA might be a little bit fed up with teams kind of having that approach to the NCAA as a whole, and that'll be an interesting thing to watch. It'll all come down to the way Charlie Baker handled this, and it sounds like June 5th and 6th is really when we're going to get a quote-unquote resolution to this. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more interesting as you get forward, but at the end of the day, we're probably reaching the end of this Michigan sign-stealing saga now. Connor Stallions, I'm sure, will have another 5 documentaries for some reason, but at the end of the day, at least in terms of the punishments for Michigan, it feels like this thing is winding down. Will this be enough? Will this be the end of this, or will Charlie Baker and his team come together and say, don't necessarily love that they're sidestepping those first 2 weeks. Maybe we suspend them for those as well. And that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Even losing that Nebraska game is going to be really interesting because that's a Nebraska team that could start 3-0 playing Cincinnati, Akron, and Houston Christian. And then you got to go to Lincoln to play that game. So that'll be a really interesting one. Maybe the damage will be done for Michigan season in that one loss. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in that, and definitely a game that you want to have your head coach for. So maybe the NCAA will say that's enough. Maybe they'll say Sherrone Moore has paid his penance. He is not necessarily the kingpin of this operation. He's just the guy that kind of got left with the short end of the stick in this situation. So maybe they're more than fine with those 2 weeks. Maybe they want to add the first 2 weeks to that, maybe make him lose his chance to coach against his alma mater. There's a lot of different things at play here, but it does sound like around June 6th, June 7th, we'll have a real answer. We'll see what happens with the NCAA if they convene and say that's more than fine for Michigan. We'll move forward. We'll let you kind of take your punishment as you see fit and kind of just move on about our business? Or do they say Michigan's trying to dodge a bullet here, and they definitely are. This is definitely preemptive of something coming from the NCAA. Will it be enough to dodge the full bullet, or will it make the hit just that little bit worse because it feels a little bit condescending to the NCAA? And I think it could go either way. It'll be really interesting to watch, and definitely something that the Wolverines are very much hoping they have their coach for those first 2 games, but I think the NCAA could have a little bit more to say about these punishments. Definitely something to watch. Definitely something that we will get into once we know the official punishments on top of this. Maybe it's just this and we can move forward knowing exactly what Michigan's going to have going into the season. Maybe the NCAA adds just a little bit more to these. And then we got a couple other big-time stories of the week. And we'll start with Akron. Akron has a postseason ban for the 2025 season because of their academics. It sounds like throughout the last couple of years, what they have is an academic progress rate. Essentially, they break down how well is your team doing in getting people to the next level of their academic career. So making sure they pass all their classes, making sure they're at classes, making sure they're passing tests, making sure they're doing the things that a student athlete, quote unquote, should have to do. Akron has officially fallen below what the threshold of 930, and the way this works essentially is they have a rating system. If you fall below 930 for 1 year, you have certain punishments. They did last year. They were at 925. They got a couple of punishments. Now they're down at 914, so it's a multi-year APR score that has gone down pretty consistently throughout the last couple of years. They're officially below that 930 threshold for multiple years in a row. They are not eligible for the postseason in 2025. And it's something that's got to get figured out. This is the first time that someone's been banned from a postseason since 2014 with Idaho. That was when they moved down to the FCS. So Akron's got to be very, very careful here. They have to make sure they get this in order. Obviously, you have a little bit more time to focus on this with knowing you won't play a postseason game. So it'll be a really interesting time around there. Maybe some players are still looking for ways to transfer out with some different rulings. It'll be really interesting to watch kind of all of this unfold, hoping that Akron gets this obviously back on track and gets in a position where they can play postseason football again. That's obviously something that they're going to have to deal with, and it could lead to a coaching change up there, could lead to a lot of different things going on up there in Akron, Ohio, but they will not play in a postseason game even if they go 12-0. They are not eligible for the CFP now. I don't think Akron's going 12-0, but in the hypothetical world, it wouldn't matter. So that's definitely a tough blow for them and something that you got to figure out. As much as we talk about the on-the-field results and how these kids aren't students anymore, this, that, and the other, and a lot of it is true. At the end of the day, you got to meet the marks. You got to at least meet the minimum requirements, and Akron hasn't. So that postseason ban will be in effect for 2025. Will it be in effect going forward in 26, 27? That's up to Akron at the end of the day. Then we had Jared Curtis, the number one quarterback in the 2026 class, come off the board. He is committed to Georgia, actually recommitted to Georgia, was committed to the Bulldogs a little bit earlier in the process, decommitted, started to look at his options a little bit more thoroughly, came down to Oregon and Georgia. Georgia was able to get him back in that class, and a remarkable player. One of those guys that really does fit what Georgia likes to do, has that running ability. I believe had 18 rushing touchdowns this past season in high school football. The kid's incredible. Whenever you watch his tape, it's very, very clear why he's the number one quarterback in the country this year. He's a very, very confident player out of Nashville, and he's one of those guys that is going to be able to elevate what Georgia does. And I think the big thing to take away here, and something that I'll write about on my blog here later in the week, is Georgia's really turning up the heat when it comes to offensive recruiting. Not necessarily tight end and running back. They've always been able to get the elite guys there, but you look at the quarterbacks they brought in, and Ryan Puglisi and Ryan Montgomery, two very, very highly touted guys, two very talented guys. Then you had the number one quarterback in the country the next year, and on top of that, this last cycle, you had Talon Taylor, a top 10 five-star wide receiver, CJ Wiley, not far from a five-star wide receiver, Landon Rowland, another guy that's very, very elite, definitely a guy that can make some plays. So when you look at this Georgia recruiting class, it's not a normal Georgia recruiting class, and it's probably for a good reason. It's not just the elite defensive linemen and the elite running backs and the elite tight ends. It's the elite everything, and especially a couple of elite wide receivers, and now you get the elite of the elite at quarterback. So, remarkable player, absolutely a guy that will come into that room pretty readily and probably compete right away. Now, Gunnar Stockton might be sticking around for 27. That's obviously a good problem to have, having all the quarterback talent they have, but Jared Curtis is about as talented as you're going to find in the quarterback class coming up, and he's going to find his way over to Athens, Georgia here pretty soon. That'll be a very, very interesting thing to watch, and this could be the guy that leads Georgia to another national title here in a couple of years. And then finally, want to get into this Clemson-Notre Dame talk. It sounds like Clemson and Notre Dame are setting up a 12-year contract to play games from 2027 all the way to 2038 every single year. Absolutely love it. Should be some incredible games, should set up a nice little rivalry for that time, maybe get a little bit more traction around Notre Dame joining some type of conference here pretty soon, but at the end of the day, love the games. It's going to be so much fun to watch. I think the one thing that we do have to be a little bit wary about here is, while Clemson in the ACC did kind of bury the hatchet for the time being, it's not all the way buried. It can definitely still be dug up, and I think in 2031 is when it probably will be dug up. That's when a lot of these TV contracts come due. That's when a lot of this stuff will start changing. Conference realignment will take a stranglehold on the sport once again around that time, and you hate to see it, but Clemson's doing something that I think might just help them when it comes to joining the SEC or joining the Big Ten. The goal is to have inventory. The goal is to have chips to bring to the table when you're negotiating different contracts and setting up yourself for the future. You got to have these games. You got to have a Georgia on the schedule like they've had the last couple of years. Or if you can set up Notre Dame for that amount of time, the Big Ten's going to look at that and really love that. The SEC is going to look at that and really love that, adding that to their repertoire. So it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. I'm not saying this is a bad thing by any means. I love that Clemson and Notre Dame are going to get on the field, and I very much hope it doesn't lead to any more conference realignment. But this feels like a little bit of a move from Clemson. This feels like, hey, let's add another great inventory to our already great amount of teams that we play, but let's add a great one. Let's add an elite team that is going to get great viewership, that we can go to the SEC in 2031 and say, you still have 7 years of this game. You still have more than enough time to get all the inventory you want, and then we'll schedule someone else. Or maybe we'll keep scheduling Notre Dame because we have that relationship. So there's a lot going on here. I don't think it's just about the games. Now, I'm very excited about the games. It sounds like Miami and Florida State could be looking into doing the exact same thing with Notre Dame. So something to watch there at the very least. It feels like a very, very good move for this first couple of years. It could be a long-term plan for Clemson to have all the ammo they need to find their way out of the ACC. So just a little bit I don't mean to, rain on the parade by any means. I think the games are going to be incredible and cannot wait to watch them. But I think the next time that someone makes a decision purely based off what the fans want will be the first time in college football. So I'm going to say that Clemson's playing a little bit of a long game here. We'll see what happens with that. We'll see if it actually equates into anything, or I'm just doing a little bit of pie in the sky here. But at the end of the day, going to be some incredible games, and we'll see how that kind of develops over the next 4 years. But an incredible amount of stuff going on in the world of college football. Obviously, the Sherrone Moore suspension is kind of taking the cake right now, and that will take the cake for the next couple of weeks. As we get closer to that official NCAA decision, we'll figure out much more about what's going on there and if that punishment was enough, or the NCAA has a little bit more in store for Sherrone Moore. That will be something to watch. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's just talk about spring practice. Let's do a quick recap. Not quite as many stories as you usually have out of spring, and that's actually something we'll talk about, but we'll get into all of it right after this, so stick with us.